welcome to the webinar today, hosted by the Moore Kingston Smith Data Protection Advisory Team. I'll make some proper introductions shortly. Today's session, Data Protection Best Practice, Culture and Awareness, is brought to you in conjunction between Moore Kingston Smith and Moore Ireland. And as I said, just some introductions. So the Data Protection Advisory Team is part of Moore Kingston Smith, the professional services firm, which offers services across all disciplines of risk advisory, data protection, cybersecurity, and also focusing on AI risk advisory as well. I'm your host, Rich Jackson. I focus on growth and strategy within the team, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Megan Mirza and Teresa Rees Thomas. And if you could, both of you, just give us a brief introduction, that would be great.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Megan Mirza, as Rich said. I'm a Senior Data Protection Officer within the team. I've been working in data protection for a number of years now and spent over 10 years working for the UK's regulatory authority, the Information Commissioner.
Good morning, all. I'm Teresa Rees Thomas. I'm a Data Protection Officer within the team. I've been working in this field for just over 10 years now, with experience in higher education, local authority, private practice, charity sector. So yeah, a variety of different sectors.
Brilliant. Thank you both. And today's webinar, just to give you by way of introduction to the series, is the first in three webinars. First of three webinars, sorry. 2 months apart between now and the end of August. Today's session, we're going to be focusing on data protection in relation to best practice, business culture, and awareness. So we're not just going to focus on legislation and compliance, GDPR, etc. We're going to be talking more deeply in terms of the human behaviors and what people need to understand in relation to personal data and the risks and pitfalls that many organizations experience. And then in the second and third sessions, we're going to go into more depth in other areas. All of the three sessions are focused particularly on the scenario in Ireland with the Data Protection Commission and their interpretation of legislation and what that might mean to an organization based in Ireland. Our team is specifically focused, today's team, on data protection, but I will touch on shortly the importance of focusing on cybersecurity as well within the subject area. Today's schedule, really what we're going to be talking about primarily is what is data protection and why does it matter to you, your staff, your organization, your customers, service users, etc. And dig into why it's more than just about compliance. It's about other areas that are also very, very important and equally important. We'll be talking about how you might create and maintain a culture in your organization that focuses on privacy and keeping people's data safe and secure. And as I said briefly before, we're going to just touch on why data protection and cybersecurity are very different, but why they need to work in harmony and how they complement each other. And when it's done well, it can keep your organization far more safe and secure than it might be as it stands. As a team of data protection officers and advisors, we also focus on almost on a daily basis on supporting our clients with two key areas or two common challenges: data breaches and subject access requests. So we'll give you some insights and guidance on how to maybe effectively manage those in a compliant and best practice manner. And then we'll finish up towards the end by a bit of an overview of the Data Protection Commission in Ireland and what that is and what it means to you. Some case studies that will be hopefully very relevant, and then we'll finish up with a question and answer session. So the question chat is open. We'll be monitoring the questions. If anyone has a question, please put it into the chat. We may not be able to deal with it in the moment, but if there's something that's really pertinent to what we're talking about at that time, we can pause and cover it. If not, those questions will be covered at the end. We're aiming for about 75 minutes today, just an hour and a quarter, with some time included in that for the questions and some answers. Hopefully we can answer all those questions. Really, this is a light touch overview. It's focused on Ireland, and where possible, we'll be using plain language, avoiding jargon, acronyms, abbreviations. This is really tailored to the audience to make sure that everyone understands exactly what we're hoping to bring across to you today. And in terms of core objectives, we have 5 main objectives for today. We want to give you a clear and concise overview of what data protection actually means to organizations in Ireland in 2026. 8 years on from the implementation of the GDPR, for example, how do we think about data protection now? What does it mean? What's changed, etc. Definitely need to raise awareness of how your people, your staff, employees, volunteers, etc., impact on your business risk every single day, because I think that's really important. It isn't just for a small group of people to worry about data protection and privacy. It's actually everyone in the organization playing their role. As I said, again, understanding the differences between data protection and cybersecurity are really important. And then raising awareness of the legislation in Ireland and what to expect from your regulator, the Data Protection Commission, which is something we'll go into in much greater detail in the 3rd session in August. So that session will be focused on that subject particularly. And then some effective management tips for common data protection challenges like the data breaches and subject access requests that I mentioned previously. So Megan and Teresa, just be interested in just your thoughts on these objectives and anything that stands out and of the 5 that you think maybe is more important, or are they sort of collectively all equally important to organizations in Ireland?
I mean, for me, it's about the people, and it's the culture of the organization. If you get that framework right and it's embedded into how you operate, then you're not going to go far wrong. But we've seen where it does go wrong, and in fact, we've seen businesses shut down on the back of regulatory action, from the supervisory authority. But for me, it's really important that trust internally and trust with the people you deal with as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that number 2 around the people and really sort of communicating within the organization that it's people at all levels. Like you say, Rich, it's not just sort of one team or one person in some cases who's responsible. It's making sure that there's buy-in really from the very senior levels in the organization. And so that message then flows down to all the teams underneath.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the word communication there, Teresa, I think is really important, isn't it? Because I know that when we're working with our clients, the communication of this subject is so important, especially before organizations decide to do something with personal data, because it's a lot easier to deal with it before the event than after things go wrong, isn't it? So I think, that communication internally, and if organizations on today's call are benefiting from external or internal data protection advice and expertise, I think that communication subject is so important, just to make sure that that person who's tasked with it understands what you're planning to do, particularly so in and around the use of AI tools, which is something we're experiencing a lot with clients at the moment. Just a bit of an overview of where we might be coming from in terms of our perspective today. Because we talk a lot, and this is something that is particular to Moore Kingston Smith and our data protection team, our advisory team, is that we are very passionate about the fact that data protection is not just about being compliant and adhering to legislation. It goes far deeper than that and can have some really significant business benefits and organizational benefits at the same time. So while yes, compliance is essential, and that will always dominate the conversation when any organization or anyone's talking about data protection, there are 2 other C's, as we refer to them, that are equally important, and in running a modern organization will play a massive part in not only keeping your organization safe and secure, but also building a really healthy culture around personal data, and also recognizing that there are huge commercial benefits and pitfalls if you get this stuff right, or if maybe you don't. So in terms of culture, we talk a lot about, and we work with senior leadership teams on a daily basis. Our clients, typically the people that we work with are decision makers in organizations such as CEOs, managing directors, finance directors, heads of HR, etc. So they play a huge part in building culture, raising awareness, and making sure that the team is diligent. And the BAU resilience at the bottom there, that's business as usual. And that's the sort of challenges we talk about with breaches or subject access and how you deal with them on a daily basis. But on the commercial side, it's incredibly important, because we're now recognizing that when our clients maybe want to bid for some new work, or they want to win a new contract, or if they're part of a merger or acquisition, they're being bought, for example, there are now really consistent and in-depth questions being asked of them in respect of data protection and cybersecurity to prove that they take this subject seriously, they have all the right measures in place, that their team are trained and aware of their obligations. And it really can be something, data protection, that can stop your business growing, or it can, as Megan alluded to, have catastrophic impact on your organization when it goes wrong. So it's absolutely about these three areas working together, and that's why we focus on the three, not just on compliance. And the other important subject just to touch on is that cybersecurity is incredibly important. Technical controls, your IT, making sure you have all of those measures in place and that you have effective defense from online attack or any threats in relation to cybersecurity are essential to every organization. It works in harmony with data protection. So neither is more important than the other. If you're focused on one but not the other, you're going to be in a weaker state. It's always the ideal scenario to be focused on both in equal measures. And something we always emphasize is that data protection is not a technology subject area. It's about protecting sensitive information from damage, loss, and corruption. It's about focusing on and treasuring personal data and the responsibility that you have for holding it and processing it. So they're the same in lots of ways. They cross over, but they're very different. And my message really in this slide is just to ensure that your organization is focused on both and not just prioritizing one over the other to such an extent that one is being neglected over the other. So enough of me sort of talking through the initial sort of intros. So Megan, just a very broad question, really. Why do we have data protection laws, and what is this stuff all about?
So GDPR is not new in terms of data protection legislation in the EU. Countries have had data protection acts, etc., really since the 1980s. We've seen it sort of on the statute book. But where there was really a step change was the introduction of GDPR, which came into play in 2018 and was across all EU member states, including the UK at that time. And we all embedded it into practice. But it really was a step change because there were different requirements in there than previously. The fines, for example, were massive. But there was a lot of panic at the time as well that the legislation was coming in because of the fines. That was what was getting all the media attention. There was a focus on consent, and there was just panic stations everywhere, including in the regulatory supervisory officers as well that were tasked with drafting or assisting with drafting the legislation and producing guidance at pace for organizations in terms of how they complied. So it was a really busy, chaotic time when the legislation came in. But a lot of the provisions are provisions that were already in place, but it's just been expanded upon and provides more rights for individuals, but also a requirement to be accountable for organizations. So that definitely is a step change. And there were some mandatory requirements that came in, such as some organizations need to have a data protection officer now. Again, some organizations already had DPOs in place voluntarily before them, but now it's mandatory if you're a public authority, for example, or you're processing lots of special category data. There's some specific requirements around compliance, and there's some requirements specifically around breaches and reporting into the regulator if it's sufficiently serious. Up until that point, it was voluntary in terms of reporting to the regulator, but now at that point it became mandatory. And just the process around dealing with data subject rights, again, was a step change. But what it does, and the intention of it is to set out a framework where organizations can do what they need to do with people's personal data, but it also gives individuals rights around that data as well. One doesn't really trump the other, but there are some quite significant rights there for individuals around the processing of personal data. So that's in the context of how you work on a day-to-day basis, but also in your private lives as well, and how you interact with organizations in your private lives. So it's there to try and get that balance right. Sometimes it skews one way or the other, but broadly speaking, that was the intention.
Yeah, and I guess as by way of example, the in 2018, this was replacing a Data Protection Act that was 20 years old, and the world had vastly changed in that period,
Yeah.
didn't it? In terms of our online presence, the sort of information that we as individuals were sharing on social media platforms, and the impact of that, and I guess the legislation was kind of catching up with how the world had changed, I suppose, to an extent.
It was. It is technology neutral, and
Yes, yeah,
that can be quite challenging when you are trying to work on something that might be AI related, for example, stuff like that.
yeah,
But you're absolutely right. It was trying to run with the times because so much progress had been made in those 20 odd years.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, as I said before, it's a people thing. So it's your customers, it's your clients. They need to trust in you in order to do business with you. And if you lose that trust, and we've seen this happen time and again with organizations with breaches, or even if they're not dealing with data subject rights appropriately, that does lose trust. So it's really important that you have that fundamental trust going forward with the people that you deal with. Um, the impact of a cyber attack or breach is significant, and it may not just be because it results in a fine, but there may be a reprimand where the organization is named, and often there's a lot of media around that as well. It's that impact, that reputational risk, and I always say that's the strongest point here is the reputational risk that goes with anything. It's also internally as well. If there's a significant breach, it's quite soul destroying for staff internally as well in terms of trying to manage that. And coming back from a significant breach can take a long time as well. So it's about that trust internally with staff and also externally with the people you deal with. And it's that embedding that culture of data around data protection in organizations that's so important, and maintaining that as well. It's okay to say it's one point in time, yeah, we're doing okay, but if that's not maintained going forward, then you will come a cropper at some point.
Yeah, we see that firsthand, don't we, with clients that are experiencing this, the sort of emotional distress,
Yeah,
the immediate sort of pressure of trying to contain what's gone wrong, but we have clients that maybe haven't slept for a couple of nights because it's
yeah,
really affecting them personally. Yeah, absolutely. And the bottom phrase about it not being a tick box exercise, I think this is such an important comment because we have lots of clients and also potential new businesses that come to us for support asking, what do we need to do to be compliant? What's the sort of baseline requirement? And that's really not the right question, is it? And it's maybe misunderstanding what data protection is really all about.
correct.
So really sort of go into the real basics of this subject area, and quite often I know from experience we've had clients that have contacted us, especially in the early days, if you like, where they feel they've had a data breach, but actually personal data wasn't even part of the incident. So understanding actually what personal data is really key, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it is defined, and you'll find a lot of definitions in the legislation are quite dense in terms of complex and feels like you're reading double negatives and all the rest of it. So today we're aiming to keep it as simple as possible. But in
Mm.
terms of personal data, and you'll hear us referring to personal data while we're talking, it's quite specific around it's someone who can be identified who are identifiable directly from the information that we're talking about, or someone can be identified from that indirectly. So broadly speaking, we're talking about basic stuff like name, contact details, that sort of high level information that distinguishes someone from another person. But it can get really quite difficult when it comes to less obvious information. An example was recently there was a case around a police dog and whether the information about the police dog was personal data. And the outcome was that it was because the name of the dog would give away the name of the handler, and therefore it was the handler's personal data. So you do get into some nonsense discussions around that. And it can sometimes get quite technical as well in terms of whether an IP address identifies someone, that type of thing as well. So also just to add, it has to be a living individual. So sometimes if you're working in the context of a hospital or a care home, you might get a request for a deceased individual's records. That doesn't come under the data protection regime, you have to be a living individual for the legislation to apply. So, but just to keep it simple, it's information that distinguishes one person from another. So, for example, in your HR teams, they will have records about you that might contain health information, or it might contain other information about you. That will all be your personal data because it's information about you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so the final bullet point about the organizations that are outside of Ireland. So we're increasingly working with organizations around the world, aren't we, that are looking to do business in the UK or in the EU for the first time and weren't aware that they would fall into scope because of the fact that they would be processing the personal data of residents of the UK and the EU.
Yeah, that's right. So if you're based in Ireland, you're processing the personal data of people that reside in Ireland, then you will be captured by the legislation. And as exactly as Rich said, organisations outside of Ireland that are processing the personal data of residents of Ireland, so they might be selling goods and services to you on a website, for example, they will be captured by the legislation as well and need to comply.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really important point. And I think that I think I'm right in saying so typically that that could be an e-commerce organization
Yeah.
based in China or and
Yeah.
that's becoming more and more common. So in terms of the legislation in Ireland itself, not too dissimilar to the UK, I guess, in terms of the wording and what we're seeing on screen.
Absolutely. So the GDPR, as I said, it came in across all member states at the same time. But what countries were then able to do was reflect on local legislation and processes, etc. So what you'll see is most countries will have the GDPR, but they'll also have a linked act. So here we've got the Data Protection Act 2018, and within that act will be island-specific exemptions and that type of thing. And also law enforcement is covered under that legislation as well, which flows from the directive. So specific to Ireland, the Data Protection Act, and most countries, as I said, will have an associated piece of legislation that slots in together with that. But you wholly need to be concerned with GDPR. That's what sets out the requirements in terms of complying. And we have the Data Governance Act, and we also have the privacy regulations, which touches on direct marketing and cookies that you need to be aware of as well.
Yeah, and every state has its version of the Data Protection Commission. So we have the ICO in the UK, and then and across Europe, it's the same, isn't it?
Yeah, and same powers, and we will talk about those as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Now we'll talk about those.
Perfect timing.
Yeah. So the Data Protection Commission, headed up by the Data Protection Commissioner, is, like all member states, the supervisory authority, and they're responsible for upholding the rights of individuals in Ireland to have their personal data protected. That means they have significant powers. So they have fining powers, and we will talk about some case studies on that. But I think some of their stronger, softer powers that maybe don't get as much publicity is the fact that they can undertake audits and they can do non-consensual audits. So if they believe or they have concerns about a particular organization, for example, they can literally just tip up and do an audit. That could result in a fine, or it could result in them issuing enforcement action to stop processing if they were that concerned. So they're quite significant powers, could knock a business out. They have requiring, if they ask for information, they have powers to require you to provide that. And they have complaints handling function as well. So they are very busy in terms of the complaints because people do complain. But all I'd say on the back of that, if the DPC contacts you or you receive a letter from them, you can't ignore it. You need to respond to that. They don't just leave things alone. If they have significant concerns, they will contact you, and any non-cooperation doesn't look good with organizations. And we've seen in some cases fines are increased because of the lack of cooperation by the organization. So really important that if you do get any correspondence from the DPC, you do need to deal with it.
Yeah. And the DPC is by far not the most prolific in terms of regular issues of financial penalties, quite similar to the UK, I think. And I guess that's down to what you would expect with legislation in terms of interpretation and implementation varies from state to state, doesn't it? So I know, for example, Spain is probably the most consistent and the most regular fining authority, but that doesn't mean that it's not taken seriously. As you said, there's all sorts of powers outside of fining, and we shouldn't
Yeah,
just focus on the financial penalties.
yeah, absolutely.
So that's really useful. And as Megan said, we'll be coming to some case studies where we'll actually demonstrate how the DPC has implemented those powers. And we've tried to pick some varying sort of sectors and instances just to give some kind of broad context. And we'll come to that later in the session. But for now, we're going to focus on creating a culture of privacy and the business impact and why data protection is so essential to your organization. And at any point, I'd invite Megan and Teresa to sort of comment on these because I think these are really, really important. And something that I think as an experienced team, we've built a service that's based on the realities of business impact and how we can help our clients. So in terms of when organizations focus on data protection in the right ways and take it seriously and have all the correct measures and cultures in place, it really does help to ensure ongoing compliance with legislation. Your organization is only as compliant as it is in the moment. In 5 minutes time, one of your team might do something that they maybe shouldn't do to cause a breach. They might click a link in a phishing email and suddenly that compliance state changes in that moment. It really can pivot that quickly. So understanding data protection is actually a constant and it should be a constant focus is really important. But by focusing on it, it really does reduce the risk of possibly breaches, that enforcement action that we've been talking about from the DPC, and that absolutely catastrophic impact of reputational damage. Because, as they say, mud does stick, and it's something that will take your organization for a long time. It's not just data protection officers that are aware of breaches from 5 years ago. If you're affected by an organization that lost your data or your data was impacted by a breach, you won't forget that. And that lends itself directly into building customer and employee trust. People are more willing to share information and engage with organizations that can clearly demonstrate that they're committed to the privacy of your personal data and the security of it. And that's why we always encourage our organizations and our clients that if they're looking to do business with a new supplier, that they check their commitment to data protection and cybersecurity, whether they've got accreditation such as ISO 27001 or Cyber Essentials certification, something to prove they take these things seriously. It absolutely prevents data breaches and incidents, so it reduces the likelihood and regularity of something going wrong. For instance, we know that data breaches are far more likely to happen on a Friday afternoon than at any other time of the week. And understanding those human error risks and the peak times and all those behaviors, absolutely essential. And we know that people are the leading cause of accidental breaches and cyber attacks via social engineering. So 90% of cyber attacks are created because a human being has done something that maybe they shouldn't have done or weren't aware that they should do, or in the moment, maybe rushing to get their work done by Friday. By the end of the day on a Friday, they click a link that maybe they should have checked a bit more carefully. So this is very much a human subject, and it's very much a business impact that's essential to your organization. Any thoughts on these, or happy for me to move on?
I think the only thing I would add, Rich, you talked there about sort of the ongoing compliance and the cost involved with breaches. And I think often clients and organizations think of that word cost alongside a financial penalty that's been imposed upon them. And actually, they don't always stop and think about the cost of their organization in dealing with that breach, the time it takes, the staff resources. You know, when we think about cases that have been in the press not that long ago, M&S, the amount of money that they lost as a result of these cyber attacks. So it's not necessarily, like you said, the financial penalty that the Information Commissioner will come along and impose, but actually there's so many other ways that financially organizations will potentially end up in, you know, with a negative impact.
Completely, yeah, and I guess the same with subject access requests, isn't
Yeah.
it? Is organizations until they've actually received their first subject access request are probably unaware of just how many hours each one will require of them. So alongside the first three sort of key areas, our experience is that good data protection supports better decision making in your organization on a day-to-day basis. So you're going to make better decisions in the moment or planning ahead uh, through understanding the importance of personal data and the impact of when things go wrong, creating that culture that values personal data and data protection, and promoting accurate data, minimizing the data that you collect initially and how long you keep it, etc., and understanding your accountability and what you're accountable for, just generally builds gradually better business insights and better decision making on a day-to-day basis. And ultimately, as we've said so many times already in this today's session, protecting your reputation, giving you that competitive advantage from a commercial perspective, are so absolutely key. And a really good quote here from Brad Smith, president of Microsoft. Securing our data is not just a legal obligation, it's a commitment to preserving the trust of those we serve. And I think if every organization were to maybe adopt that mindset, I think that would be absolutely fantastic. And I know that even though it's so important to still have data protection expertise at hand, day to day, you need that as an internal mindset as well. So I think that's a really great quote from Brad Smith. We've mentioned the fact that data protection is directly linked to commercial growth. I think these are just some brief points that would be worth emphasizing again. So this is all about helping to protect people, not just your business. It stops personal information being misused or exposed, whether deliberately or accidentally, when that protects both your customers and your staff. And I think a lot of organizations forget the employees or their volunteers, and they focus mainly on customers and service users. So, and maybe overlook just how important the personal data is and the sensitivity of the data that they keep on staff and volunteers, etc. I think it makes perfect sense to say that good habits lead to good decision making. Errors and near misses are less likely. Building that trust and professionalism within the business, so important. And again, I guess most of all, keeping the organization compliant and resilient leads to less breaches, less complaints, less to business disruption, and generally protects your reputation. So I think from your perspective, Megan and Teresa, very broad brush, I guess, these comments, but this is probably the core aspect of how we work with clients, isn't it? And why we exist to support clients.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, what does good look like? And the best organizations that I've worked with or done audits on, or where we've been assessing something when it's gone wrong, for example, and things will go wrong, even in the best organizations, is the senior level oversight. And Teresa touched on that before. And it's having an information governance board sitting above the business. Doesn't have to be hugely complex, but where data protection feeds up in terms of, for example, number of subject access requests you've had and that type of thing. And it's that senior level oversight that then feeds back down as well in terms of accountability. And that is really important, where you'd have different business areas feeding into that oversight. It doesn't matter what you call it, but having some sort of governance in place at a senior level is really important. And that's where data protection, it looks good in terms of if you are, doing an audit of that type of organization, you'd be looking at governance, and that's really number one from my perspective in terms of oversight and culture and bringing it to life effectively.
Yeah, yeah, completely. I mean, I think it's always more effective to undertake something because you want to do it and because you have a passion for it and you understand that it's really important, as opposed to because the legislation tells you to. And I think that's something I think we see in clients, I guess, is that those that actually understand that this is something that they should want to be doing properly, as opposed to doing because the legislation tells them they have to and there's consequence if they don't. I think that's probably a big takeaway from today, I guess. So data protection in practice. I'm going to hand over to Teresa at this point. Got some really important slides in terms of the key requirements of the legislation. Yeah, so Teresa, over to you.
Thank you. So I think, Megan, you mentioned earlier on that some areas of the legislation can be sort of very wordy, very complex, and sometimes you read it and wonder whether you need to read it 3 or 4 times before you sort of actually understand what it is that you're supposed to be taking in. But I think when we look at how we comply with the legislation, we've talked a lot about why we should do that, privacy of culture, etc., within the organization, looking at how we go about those client actions. Really, the pillars of the GDPR can be found within the principles, and this is where we look to understand what we should be doing with the personal data that we're processing. So we'll just read very briefly through them. And I think that this first principle, which talks about fairness, transparency, making sure that as an organisation, we're telling people who we are, what data we're collecting about them, why we're doing that, how long we're going to keep it for. So we're really setting the expectation at the outset of that relationship so that individuals, again, will increase their trust in us. They are under no illusions as to what we're doing with their data. So that's a really key principle in the law. And we also have to have, it's called a lawful basis. Essentially, it's a reason within the law that allows us to process the personal data for whatever the reason is that we've chosen. We also need to make sure that we have identified the purpose that we want to process that data for. We can be clear about what that is. We can tell people what that is in terms of transparency. And we're not sort of chopping and changing our mind midway through the process. As I say, those decisions are made at the outset, which is really important. Looking at data minimization, again, a really, really key principle here. We shouldn't be processing more data than we need to. And it's sort of a common sense approach, really. But I think some organizations will take that sort of just in case approach, and they'll collect lots more information than they need at the time, because at some point it might be useful for an additional project that they might look to. But actually, what we really should be doing is identifying the minimum information that we need in order to achieve the purpose that you've identified. And making sure that you keep your data accurate. Again, common sense from a commercial perspective. I would argue that inaccurate data probably isn't of huge value to an organization anyway, but making sure that you take steps to keep that data accurate is really, really important when we think about compliance with data protection legislation. Storage limitation or retention schedules. Again, I don't know about you, Rich and Megan, but I know when I've spoken to clients or organizations, this is always sort of a bit of an issue, because sometimes organizations will have identified retention schedules and they've had conversations and they know how long things should be kept for, but actually that doesn't always filter through to actually actioning that, which is obviously they sort of done part of the work, but they haven't actually finished off that process, which is frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the often described as the headache of the legislation in terms of trying to deal with it. Yeah.
People end up with sort of boxes of paper folders under their desk and that sort of thing. And then, Rich, you talked about sort of commercial benefits. I worked with an organization who was looking to spend money on additional storage facilities. And actually, when we broke down what they were looking to store in those facilities, we shouldn't have been holding it anyway. There were conversations around, this kind of topic of retention. And so rather than spending money on additional storage, arguably it's better for lots of different reasons to look at what your appropriate retention is for that information and whether you should be storing it anyway. So I think there's some important lessons there. And then data security. Again, we talked already about sort of cybersecurity and making sure that we have those technical and organizational measures in place within the organization to keep that personal data secure. Not just client data, but like Rich said, your employee data. You might have a number of different categories of people whose data you process, and making sure that you've got appropriate measures in place is really, really critical to make sure that you're processing in line with the principles. And then sort of underpinning all of those principles, we have accountability, like Megan said, with the inception of the GDPR. And essentially that tells us now that it's not good enough for us to just sort of say, oh, yes, we comply with everything. We have to be able to demonstrate that. We have to be able to justify to the regulator what we have in place, the framework like Megan referred to, so that we're accountable to all of the people whose data we process, and there are a number of different ways that we are expected to do that. I think we might have a slide on that, Rich, do we?
Yeah, I was just going to briefly say that, I mean, something that really runs through all of these, and I guess it does absolutely when we're working with clients, is that all of this from the outset, I think was the phrase you used. If by focusing on all these essential parts of data protection from the outset and by design, is so much more effective and is likely to keep you compliant than if you, as an organization, you pursue your commercial objectives and then worry about personal data and data protection after the event, and then you have to retrofit the whole process. And there's always that balance to strike between an organization wanting to achieve its commercial objectives and then I guess, the trade-off in their minds about can we achieve that and what are the personal data implications? And I think all we can say there is really that if you bake in good a good focus on personal data and data protection right from the outset on day one, and we work with a lot of startups and we talk to them about this as a key element. I think that's absolutely key.
So in terms of, there's a number of different ways, but these are sort of the practical ways that organizations would look to meet their accountability obligations. So making sure that you have appropriate data protection related policies in place. You know, have you given thought to what the organization is going to do in order to meet your compliance requirements? Do we know what teams are involved? Like Megan said, is there senior leadership? Are there boards in place where this communication is going to be reported up to, and then actions may be reported down to operational teams? So making sure that you've got those sort of formal documents in place is really important for accountability, but I would argue also within your organization to make sure that everybody understand where the responsibility lies and who is playing their part in this role. Making sure that you have privacy notices in place. One of the first principles that we talked about was around transparency, making sure that people know what's happening with their data. Generally, organizations will encompass all of those different categories of information within a privacy notice. Making sure that when we receive subjects' rights, so data subject access requests, for example, again, we have a process in place. So rather than panicking because you've received one and nobody's really sure what to do with it, like Rich said, think about that before the request is submitted so that we know when it comes, where it's likely to come to, who has responsibility for managing it, etc. There are some organizations where you need to have a documented record of processing activities. Again, I would argue, even if it's not a legal requirement for your organization, having a really clear understanding of where your data is, where does it come into, what happens once it's in your organization, what systems is it stored on, do you share it externally with anybody, is a really, really good start in making sure that all of those processing activities are compliant. Because if you don't know sort of where your data is or what's happening to it, it's very difficult to make sure that you're compliant. So that's a really key one, I think. And then the last one on this slide is making sure that you have a process in place for data protection impact assessments. So if you've got a new initiative that's being introduced or a new project, we need to think about the risk. And part of that risk will be identifying any privacy risk. There's a formal process that you need to follow for that. But again, like Richard said several times, it's making sure the people in your organization are aware of these things, because if the data protection professional is aware, but the project manager isn't, there's potentially then a disconnect, a lack of communication. So it's about making sure that these are communicated across the board so that everybody really understands what their own obligation is to make sure that the company is compliant as they can be.
Brilliant. Thanks, Teresa. I'd be interested in both your thoughts on data protection impact assessments, DPIAs, in relation to what we're seeing with our clients adopting AI tools, and maybe sort of in fear of being left behind, they adopt tools very, very quickly and maybe not having all the right checks and balances. And I guess DPIAs play a big part there.
Yeah, I think actually data protection impact assessments are a hugely valuable tool, whether you meet the legal requirement of having to complete one or not. It often will stop operational teams and almost sort of force them to think about questions that perhaps they hadn't considered originally, because, as you say, Rich, they're sort of following that commercial benefit, which is completely understandable. You know, we've got to sort of strike a balance, but it's not until you sit down and you look at the queries around what is the data, where's it going, who are these people, what are we going to do to protect it? And like I say, until you're sort of stopped and you're asked these questions, sometimes I think they can be overlooked. And with AI particularly, obviously, this is, you know, extremely important.
And what I'm often saying, I absolutely 100% agree with that. What I'm often saying, particularly in the context of AI tools, because often organizations don't know people are using the tools because they've just, downloaded it off the internet or whatever, is to do a DPIA before you go out to procurement, looking at actually what are you trying to achieve and how are we going to achieve that? And then you can start looking at the potential suppliers and then focusing in on them to see if they're fit for purpose in terms of how they're going to use your data. Are they going to use it for training of their AI models and stuff like that? So there's a lot of thinking that needs to go in, but it's all about protecting your organization and protecting the information that you hold, rather than you just throwing it out to some random new AI processor supplier that may not be fit for purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And knowing where that data's going as well, isn't
Yeah,
it?
100%.
Geographically.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mentioned right at the start what we refer to as BAU, business as usual, and common challenges, and there are two particular activities or instances that we support our clients with on a really regular basis. I mean, so several times a day in some instances. Data subject access requests and data breaches. And obviously, as Megan was talking about earlier, when the GDPR came into play, people were very focused about breaches and the impact of breaches. Maybe not so focused on subject access rights and what that actually meant in practice to an organization. And we're going to be talking about those in more depth. One thing I would add with subject access requests, we're seeing a huge increase over the last 15 months, almost since the beginning of January 2025. We've seen a sudden surge in the regularity of these requests coming into organizations. They're dealing with more day to day, and we're fairly confident that AI is playing a part in that as well, aren't we?
It's just the way they're written.
Yeah.
So we yes, AI will have will be playing a part here, but it's the way the requests are written. They're very legalistic, and organizations that may not have received one before are on the back foot straight away because of the terminology being used. But actually, it is just a subject access request, so it's unpicking that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll start with them, and Teresa, invite you to kick us off on subject access requests.
Yeah, just a little bit of background, really. I think the main crux of what we want to talk about in relation to subject access will be the practical sort of preparation that organizations can have in place. But in terms of subject access, it's just one of a number of rights that individuals have under data protection legislation. In my experience, this tends to be the one that we see people exercise most often. Occasionally you might see a couple of other requests come through, but subject access request, in my experience, is the one that I think people are most aware of as individuals, and certainly as organizations, it seems to be the one that people receive the highest number of. And the purpose behind this right is to help individuals understand what organizations are doing with their data, what information they hold, and in order for them to be able to sort of make those checks and satisfy themselves that it's being used lawfully. So when an individual submits a subject access request to your organisation, there are a number of different things really that they are entitled to receive from you. So the first thing that you need to look at is confirmation as to whether or not you're processing the personal data of this individual. It might be a current member of staff, it might be a previous member of staff, it might be a customer that you interacted with a year ago. So you don't have to have a current relationship with the individual or with the organisation that you're making the request to. So as I say, the first step really is to identify whether or not you are actually processing any personal data of this person. And if you are, they are entitled to receive a copy of that data and other supplementary information, which tends to be the categories of data that you would include in a privacy notice. So making sure they understand whether their data has been shared with anybody, how long you're likely to be keeping that data for, and so on. So those are the types of things that we would look to provide in response to a subject access request. Couple of sort of high level facts here just to be aware of. Generally, when individuals submit a subject access request, it's their own data that they're entitled to. Often people will ask for a whole host of information, some of it relating to them, some of it relating to third parties. But it's really important to understand that under subject access, it's their personal data that they are entitled to. And I think, again, Megan, I don't know whether you would agree with this, but I think sometimes individuals' expectations when they submit a subject access request is perhaps slightly skewed. They believe that they're entitled to a lot more information, either than they are entitled to, or that an organisation holds a lot more information than they actually hold in reality.
Absolutely. And that's often the essence of complaints to the regulators is the organisation hasn't provided me with all I'm entitled to receive or all that they hold. So it is quite a difficult area.
Yeah, absolutely. Organisations generally have a month in order to go through the process of identifying whether that data is held, collating anything that's relevant, making sure that there's nothing within that information that shouldn't be disclosed. There are some nuances which allow that month to be extended, but it really has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And there is a fairly high threshold, I would say, for meeting that extension. Like I said, people can ask for a whole host of information from you, but there are a number of exemptions available within the legislation that allow you to withhold information. So, for example, if an individual is asking for a confidential reference that had been provided for employment purposes, perhaps people are allowed to ask for that, but there are exemptions in the law which would allow an organisation to withhold that. So it's important to understand again that they exist, but that they also have to be considered on a case by case basis. There's no sort of blanket exemptions. You can't sort of say, well, all 1,500 pages are exempt because perhaps part of it allows an exemption to be relied on. So it really is just taking them all based on the circumstances that are in front of you and making those decisions. The legislation doesn't tell individuals how they have to submit their request. I think it's not unusual that organisations will have a form of some description on a website that they might direct individuals to in order to submit their request. But it is really important to note that you can't force an individual to complete a form. They can ask for it verbally, they can send an email, they can ask you in person. So if you have a security team, for example, and somebody comes up to a member of your security and asks for a copy of their personal data, this again is why it's so important that everybody across your organisation is aware that these rights exist and how to recognise a request. They may not be responsible for providing a response, but it's really important that everybody understands what this right covers, what it might look like, and then what to do with it once they've received it. So who in the organisation should they liaise with to make sure that that request is dealt with appropriately?
That's such a good point, isn't it? Because I think this is what organizations probably sometimes overlook, that if anyone's connected, as you said, email, telephone, even on social media, they could be the individual that first receives the request. And because there's only a calendar month, you can lose so much time, maybe while they are not realizing what that is or who to pass it to, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, you often see organizations who will receive a request, but not to the team that they have identified who will deal with it. And they'll go back to the individual and say, you have to submit it to X, Y, and Z. Whereas actually that clock starts ticking generally at the point that the organization receives the request. So it's really important that you have that policy, that process identified so that we know exactly who to escalate that request to when it comes in, so that we don't waste any time that we could be spending in collating the response.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you talked, Rich, about sort of planning is always better than reacting. Having those conversations before you're in a mess is always preferable. So we've just got some points here, which hopefully will be helpful pointers in order to put those plans in place, have those conversations now. And the first one, much like we talked about the record of processing activity, is really having a clear understanding as to what personal data is held on which electronic systems. Do you have filing cabinets? Do you have hard copy data? Do you have personal data recorded on Teams, on Zoom, etc.? I think it's fairly unusual now for organizations just to have one electronic system. There's often a number of different platforms that companies are using. So yeah, just having a really good understanding as to where personal data is held, so that when that request comes in, you're not sort of scrabbling about wondering where on earth you should do your searches. You already know where personal data is likely to be, so you can conduct those searches efficiently. We talked about retention being a really key pillar of those sort of how you are to comply with the legislation, making sure you've identified retention schedules, making sure that you know if email should only be kept for a year, perhaps let's not keep them in our inbox for 5 years. Obviously, that will help us when we are searching for and collating information for subject access. It's likely to narrow down significantly the amount of information that you have to go through when you're providing that response. Like I've said, making sure that you have a formal procedure in place so the organization knows, but staff within the organization are aware of how those requests will be managed, which team or individual will take responsibility for that, making sure all staff know how to recognise a request. I think it's a really, really fundamental part of any staff training that you conduct, making sure, like I say, that staff, they don't have to know the ins and outs of how they would provide a response, because that likely will be handled by a specific team, but just raising awareness so that people know what the request is likely to look like and who they communicate that to, I think is really key. And then when you have the response, again, that sort of technical security measures, making sure that you know how you're going to provide it, whether or not you're going to use encryption, whether you're going to use a site that you host internally that you can give somebody access to. Again, the law doesn't tell you what you should do in sort of black and white, but you just need to make sure that you've given thought to this so that you are securing and protecting that data end to end.
So on the first bullet point, Teresa, in terms of where that data resides, I think, is it fair to say we've had issues with clients not realizing that that would also be chat tools such as WhatsApp, and this then becomes problematic?
Yeah, we get many questions on that as well. And I was just going to add on there, CCTV is another one, because you potentially might need to redact the footage before you release it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many, I think, different forms of personal, audio. Do you have phone call recordings? There's just a whole host of different places where personal data can be stored, which I think is why it's so important to sort of go through meticulously and understand what platforms you're using so that when the request comes in, you've got a fairly good handle on where that's likely to be.
Yeah, I think there's nothing more sort of sobering in terms of focusing on retention schedules than a really difficult subject access request, and then realizing that it wasn't a great idea to keep everything, keep stuff forever or for 10 years. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So Megan, data breaches.
Okay. So breaches can often be wider than what you think. So you might think about it as losing something, but actually it's can be the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data. And it can be accidental or deliberate. As I said, it's more than just losing it. So, for example, we've had cases where organizations have accidentally deleted data, and therefore it's become unaccessible for staff, for example, and they've had to report that in as a breach. We've had loss is the main one, as well as unauthorized disclosure. So sending an email off to the wrong address is the frequent flyer. When I worked at the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, the frequent flyer was emails or loss of paper records, actually, and primarily barristers and solicitors leaving papers in cafes, sensitive family court papers, that type of thing was a really high level breach in terms of recurring. So it can be all those different things. You need to be aware of that. And then it's around the process for managing that. And that is really important. And it links back to the SARS point. You need to know beforehand how you're going to handle something when it goes wrong. And that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I've talked about some of them. So we're talking about access by an unauthorized party. So that might be where an organization is hacked, for example, and data is extrapolated off the system. That can lay a company out for weeks, if not months. We've worked with organizations that were virtually out of action for 6 months while they were trying to restore what was lost. Sending personal data to an incorrect recipient is often emails, as I said, going off to the wrong person, but they can be really sensitive emails. And if someone hasn't password protected the attachment, for example, that can lead into a breach being reportable. I've seen some horrendous ones. One of the worst ones was someone's occupational health report being sent to all staff in an organization. So it's that type of thing. It's being very careful if you're sending attachments with emails, particularly if it's sensitive, and checking and double checking before you hit that send button. Laptops being lost or stolen, if it's encrypted, that's not going to be so much of an issue. But again, it's just being careful when you're out and about. We've had cases of people leaving laptops and devices on top of cars as they get into the car and then drive off, so everything's gone. Alteration of personal data. We don't see too much evidence of that, but yeah, that would certainly be a breach. Loss of availability, so that could be where your systems go down. I was working for a company where construction people accidentally cut through all the wires, and so we had no access to IT for about a week. So loss of availability, that was a reportable breach. And as I said, paperwork being lost or stolen. It's incredible where people put paperwork or where they leave paperwork. It would make you lie awake at night. But yeah, lots of just, leaving papers on public transport, in cafes, as I said, or at home, actually. And information where people take stuff home to work at home, and and then it gets lost from there, whether the car gets stolen or their house gets broken into. We've seen cases of that as well. So it's just being careful when you're processing and holding personal data.
Yeah, I think the home worker scenario, we've had instances with clients where there's been maybe a lack of process or lack of agreement in terms of what staff are actually doing or what they're taking home. And
if they can print.
Yeah,
Printing
exactly.
sensitive stuff. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think I'd be fairly confident that the loss of availability of personal data is the type of breach that most organizations would be least aware of, qualifies as a breach, I would guess.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah. So there's a lot to do, and that's why you need to have staff training around this so people know what to do. The worst thing is, and I think Rich alluded to this, where we've had staff in organizations on calls with us and they look ill because of the stress of having to deal with an incident. So it's quickly looking at what's happened, how has it occurred, and trying to contain it. So if it's an email that's gone off to the wrong address, you will contact the recipient. You'll either ask them to double delete it or return the data however it's got to them, but it's promptly taking steps, and it's assessing the risk of harm. And that's really the umbrella under which you need to look through in terms of assessing whether it's reportable to the DPC or not. So if someone's at risk of harm as a result of the breach, or has actual harm has been done, it will be reportable to them, but it also may be reportable to the individuals whose information is at the heart of all of this. So, for example, I've seen horrendous domestic violence cases where the address of the safe house where the family are hiding from the alleged perpetrator has been disclosed to the alleged perpetrator. So that's put their lives at risk immediately, and they've had to be moved. So that type of thing. So it's taking steps to address it, but also thinking about reportability, because you've got a 72-hour deadline in which to report to the regulator if it is reportable.
Yeah, and that's from when you become aware of it.
Correct. So if it happens late on a Friday, for example, that clock's ticking as soon as you know that there's been a breach.
Yeah.
So yeah, as I said, it's assessing the harm and damage arising out of the breach, and if it's likely or has actually happened, then you need to notify them within 72 hours. That is a really short time frame. And thinking about telling the individuals, the organizations I work with, they're not so concerned about reporting to the regulator, but the idea of reporting to the data subjects is the least attractive option, because again, it links into that trust that they may have, depending on who it is, or it could be staff, for example. And that's normally the worst part of it, is having to tell people that you've lost their data or something's gone wrong. And they are now, there's a lot of people now claiming compensation for these type of breaches as well. Sorry, I should have added that on. We're seeing organizations having to pay out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think adding all breaches to the internal breach log or record,
Yes.
I think has a real benefit beyond probably what people realize in terms of actually identifying trends. We did some work with a client, Megan, didn't we, last year, where we put together some data from their breach log in terms of identifying when breaches were happening, because they were having so many and so regularly, and we identified certain times of the week, certain times of the day on those
Yeah.
days.
Yeah.
And we tied that down to particular employees, not in respect of the blame or the blame culture, but to identify maybe some
Training.
additional training needs.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually then that did have some sort of impact on reducing the breach regularity. So we're sort of conscious of time, but we're okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, enforcement decisions. So we've got a couple of examples on screen. Just again, as I mentioned before, to give you some sort of view of diversity of the types of organizations and the kinds of instances and what's caused these enforcement actions by the DPC in Ireland.
Yeah. And often it will be maybe a one-off breach, but that will then everything else will start to unravel around it, because often it will be that the organization didn't have proper policies in place or training for staff, and that will all form part of the decision making when it comes to fining. So the University of Limerick, that's a significant fine, 98,000 euros. For a further education institute, but it's the reputational risk, because there'll be student data there, but they didn't report it as they should have done, and that'll add on to the level of the fine as well, because you can be fined for not reporting within that 72-hour deadline. But this is often what we see. We see it might be a hack or something along those lines, but everything else will unravel in the background behind it. And we've seen many fines that have gone higher than what you would think they would go because of that. The organization hasn't taken data protection seriously and doesn't have in place that framework around it. City of Dublin Education and Training Board, again, lack of appropriate security measures in place. Again, not reporting as they should have done, a serious breach, and again, a significant fine, 125,000 euros. Again, it's that reputational risk that goes with all of this, because this all goes out into the media. The organizations are named on the DPC's website. Links to the decision notices go on there as well in terms of the enforcement notice. So you get quite a lot of detail there as well. So it's often very hard for organizations to turn around after something like that goes wrong, both for staff internally as well.
Yeah.
And a credit union one, again, it doesn't seem like a significant fine there, 5,000 euros, but it's again that reputational risk, and it was around the handling of a data subject access request, which is really interesting. So not providing all the data requested, the CCTV, so I touched on that as being a tricky area to deal with when you get a subject access request, and looking, having those procedures in place around looking at how you locate and respond to access requests as well. So they did get that fine, not a huge fine, but even so, it's the reputational damage that goes with that. An interesting linked case in the UK is where an individual has actually been prosecuted for refusing to respond to a subject access request. So a director of an organization was taken through the court, and he now has a criminal conviction and was fined on top of that as well for refusing to deal with the subject access request on behalf of the organization. I'm not sure the DPC would go so far as prosecuting an individual, but it's interesting to see that they will fine on those subject access request cases if they're not handled and dealt with appropriately.
Yeah, I mean that was my take, and this is why we've kind of added this little pop-up for this one because I think it is important, isn't it, to focus on the fact that they will enforce
Yeah.
regardless of organization size. So this sort of myth small organizations sometimes have that they won't be in scope, or even that from a cybersecurity perspective, oh, we won't be attacked because we're only small. Why would anybody attack us? That really doesn't come into context at all. Um, and it just highlights those common operational risks, such as the DSAR processes, which we've emphasized so much through today's session, really.
And again, some further ones there. And you can look at, I mean, if you're interested, you can look at these in a bit more detail on
Yeah.
the DPC's website. So Department of Social Protection, that talks about the legal basis, which is again quite an interesting one. They didn't have a fine, but there was a reprimand there. So again, it's in the public domain. May as well have been a fine given the negative media. So that was sort of some of the basic compliance requirements that they didn't have in place. And TikTok, there's been a load of media about that. Quite a
Yeah.
significant fine there,
Yeah.
530 million. But that's about transferring personal data outside of the EU. And there have been a number of cases on that for organizations that are doing international transfers. And if they don't have the right safeguards in place, they will take action. And that's a complex area in and of itself, international transfers.
Yeah, and that just demonstrates, doesn't it, the sort of the scale that the supervising authorities have to oversee. You've got
Yeah.
your sort of small credit union, 5,000 euros, all the way up to TikTok or the likes of Meta, etc. They all come within scope of their supervision.
And potentially in the scope of DPC, yeah, they've
Yeah,
seem to have landed with a load of those. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So before we get on to some questions, just to highlight that everybody attending today's session would be absolutely welcome. We would love to have you join us the next two sessions as well. So human firewall is a really interesting area where we focus on why people are the key to data protection and cybersecurity. So we focus a lot there on human psychology and why we trust things that maybe we shouldn't, and why we click links, even though in hindsight it was pretty obvious that it was a dangerous thing to do. So that's on Wednesday, 24th of June. And then the third episode in this series is very much focused on the Data Protection Commission in terms of legislation and compliance, and just takes a deeper dive into the DPC and what organizations should be aware of, and to get maybe a more granular understanding of the commission and its role and how that knits into operating as an organization within Ireland. And that's on Wednesday, the 26th of August. Today's session will be available via a YouTube link that we'll provide after the session, and also the slides will be provided as well. So, questions. I think we do have a
I
question.
think there is one in the chat. Yeah. Could you explain in more detail why loss of availability due to systems going down is considered a data breach? Availability is just one of the terms within the definition of what is a data breach, and loss of availability because it means that you can't access personal data, you can't process as you should be doing as an organization. And so, yeah, it's considered a data breach. And it's one of the core sort of principles around security is availability, integrity of the data, that type of thing. So, yeah, it is there.
Yeah.
Because,
In the event of
yeah,
a ransomware attack. So, for example, where even though the data might not have been shared elsewhere, just the fact that they've contained your data and taken away your access to it is why that's in breach territory, isn't it?
yeah, and that potentially puts people at risk as well. So if you work in, for example, a health care organization, for example, and you can't access patient records because they're unavailable, that's absolutely in breach territory.
Yeah.
And you think even sort of internal individuals, if it was data relating to pay, for example, would employees then not be receiving their compensation at the end of the month? So I think there's so many different ways that individuals can be impacted by that loss of availability.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so that's the questions for now. So yeah, if anyone does have a question beyond today's session, we'll send out an email address. It'll be dpadvisory@mks.co.uk. We're having some issues with screen sharing at the moment, but those details will be sent to everybody. So if you do have a question on today's event, anything we haven't covered, or if you'd like more detail we can absolutely provide that. Yeah, and reach out to the team at any point. So we're bang on 11:15, so we're perfectly timed. Just like to thank Megan and Teresa for all of your contributions today and insights. It's been real pleasure as always to work with you on a webinar. And thank you to the team in the background for setting up today's session. And that's us for now. So hopefully we'll see you again in June on the next webinar. But for now, thank you very much.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Teresa.